Good morning, everyone. So this will be our first topic-based Zoom in our 2021 series, and we'll be covering intra-location transfer transactions today. So our agenda for this morning will be concepts, choosing the correct transaction, notes for initiators and approvers, and then to wrap up, we'll do best practices in review with a question and answer session at the end. So Cherry, just like when we're on our office hours, we'll be managing that Q&A. So I'm going to ask that everybody put your questions into the chat if they come up during the presentation. And then Cherry will be answering questions in the chat as we go along. And she'll also be the one to stop me if there's any clarification that's needed on any given topic. So please hold your questions till the end of the call, and we'll have ample time to go over anything that folks ask. So the first concepts that we're going to get started on today is auto termination and funding impacts of intralocation transfers. So auto terminations are a rather cumbersome point of intralocation transfers if that employee is auto terminated by accident before the transfer occurs. So if the separating department has that auto termination take place before the transfer, they'll have to do a rehire reinstatement, and then they'll have to go ahead and do another template transaction to complete their termination transaction. So for example, if we've got an employee who has an auto termination date of 6/27 and their transfer date will be that following Monday after the weekend on 6/30, then if that employee is auto terminated, that separating department will have to do a rehire reinstatement on effective 6/27, and then they'll have to do a termination template following. So you can tell that for the employee, they'll be adversely impacted because one, they're going to lose all of their access to anything that they have, including systems access like email from ITS, and it's going to disrupt their pay. So that employee is going to be adversely affected in that way. Not to mention the time to process that rehire reinstatement will be 3 to 5 business days, and then the separation will be another 3 to 5 business days. So it's very important to actively manage our appointments in UCPath, specifically in PayPath for those expected job end dates. Now, if we have the example on the flip side, so the auto termination date is set for 6/30, but their transfer date is going to be effective on 6/27. If that employee auto terminates by accident, so that transfer hasn't been processed on 6/27 yet, in that case, then we don't have to rehire reinstate the employee. Because what we can do then, if they were auto terminated on 6/30, is the separating department would just process a termination template effective 6/27, and then the hiring department, the concurrent hire template. So depending on where that auto termination lands and what the actual transfer date of the employee is very important. And we want to make sure that if that auto termination date is set before the transfer, that we actively manage that expected job end date. The second concept that we're going to cover this morning is going to be impacts to funding. So, as many of you know, if you're doing any type of general campus comp plan or health science comp plan funding, the MCOP worksheet is only available on the hire date and after. So in this case, it would be the transfer date. So if you're looking to set up anything MCOP related, you're going to have to wait until that hire date to set that up. Remember that that MCOP worksheet as well is only going to show as a blue hyperlink if you've already set up the appointment that way in the job earnings distribution, also known as JED. So some points about MCOP there to remember. The next thing that I wanted to bring up is the UC transfer template. So you'll hear the UC transfer template referred to as an intra-location transfer template. Throughout this presentation, I will refer to it as a UC transfer template because intra-location transfer also applies to the concurrent hire and voluntary termination process. So I will call it a UC transfer template throughout this presentation. But if Department A to Department B, if a UC transfer template is used to move that employee to Department B, Department A will no longer have access to do direct retros on that EMPL record since it's now moved to Department B, and they don't have access to Department B. So for this reason, There are issues with direct retros in the UC transfer template, and that will guide some of our guidance that we'll be giving in a few slides from now. If you have done a UC transfer template and you need to do a direct retro, you'll have to reach out to a global access user in a central office to perform on your behalf if that's the case. So very important funding impact of using that UC transfer template. The next thing that I would want to mention here is that anytime somebody is transferred into a new department using that same EMPL record, we're going to need to initiate a transaction in funding entry effective on their hire or after. Because what happens is when we're pulling the current funding information, even if that funding is correct on the position, it's not going to recognize the new employee in that position if the effective date on the funding doesn't reflect their hire date or after. And this would also be true, for example, for a rehire. So if you've got somebody that's been rehired or transferred into a new position that has existing funding, you're going to need to make that funding update to make sure that the earnings are hitting those funds that are designated. Otherwise, it will go to the department default account. And then just to reiterate one more time, that direct retros will be disabled to the previous department if the EMPL record is reused. So in that case, if it's a UC transfer template or a rehire template is processed, because both will be reusing that EMPL record. All right, so our next section that we'll be covering today is choosing the correct transaction. So here we'll go over review pages, intra-location transfers, action reason codes, and then reclassifications. So the review page, the first one that we're going to go over is person org summary. And so what's viewable on this page? So here you can see job assignment information for all employee records across all locations. So you can see if an employee has previous employment records at UC Santa Barbara, you can see what their current appointments are here at UC San Diego across all UC locations. And this is going to show you their organizational relationships. It's going to show you their HR and payroll status, their hire date, their termination date. I put that in quotes because we'll go over that on the next slide, if applicable. It'll also show the current employee's information for all their organizational relationships, like I said, at the UC locations. And it will show you some basic overview information in the next screenshot that I'll show. This isn't going to get into the nitty gritty of salary information. It's not going to show you any historical data. It's not going to show you future dated employment details. None of this is available as a high level overview. Remember that person org summary is viewable by everyone at any UC location. So those kinds of sensitive details won't be shown here because regardless if you're a funding or an HR person, you'll have access to this page. So the reasons why we recommend that folks go here first is to determine the employment status of that specific employee. So it's going to show you their HR and payroll statuses if they're active or inactive. And that's particularly important because if we're looking to transfer somebody, they need to have an active status at that time. So any inactive folks aren't going to be able to transfer because that designation is given to them. That wouldn't be a transfer. It would be a rehire or something else. The other reason why we want to go here is to ensure that whatever action you're looking to take isn't in conflict with the terms and conditions of their current employment. So you'll be able to use this as a launching point to solve any issues that you might need to before processing your templates. So here's what the page looks like. We've got the navigation on the left-hand side, and I wanted to go over a few of these green boxes around specifically because person org summary is a little misleading in my opinion to a new user specifically. So the first thing that I'd want to point out in the upper right-hand corner, there is a view all functionality. So typically, if you go to this person's profile in person org summary, you're only going to see one row of data and you can click between them unless you click that view all, which is very important to see all of their appointments across the UC locations. Now, next I'll start with the upper left-hand corner. So here you'll see org instance reference. So in layman terms, this is actually their EMPL record. So person org summary refers to EMPL record as org instance. And that can be very confusing to folks because generally in training materials, we're going to call it an employee record or an EMPL record. Now, when you're processing a concurrent hire, it's not going to be called empl record or org instance. They'll call it an instance number. So you can see how the same thing is called multiple things throughout UCPath depending on which module you're in. So org instance is going to be synonymous with employee record, empl record, or instance number in the concurrent hire specifically. So all things to keep in mind. They all mean the same thing, but they're all called different things depending on where you're at. The next box I'll go over is the last hire. And so this indicates the start date of that specific empl record. So I would actually call this the original hire date for that employee record number. So for example, if you're looking at folks on their conversion data row, that's going to be their empl record 0. That last hire date is going to reflect their original hire date that was listed in PPS. Now, if we were to do a transfer using a concurrent hire, that last hire field is going to show their hire date specific to that empl record since the concurrent hire template creates a new empl record. So this start date is a little misleading in the fact that it's not the start date of, let's say you use a UC transfer template, that won't be reflected on this field. It's actually going to show the start date of their original hire into that empl record. The next field I want to go over is the termination date. And so on the previous slide, I put termination date in quotes because this isn't the effective date of their termination. This is actually their last day worked. So again, this field is called termination date, but it's actually referring to their last day worked, which is very misleading. To see that actual effective date of their termination, you're going to want to go to Workforce Job Summary. So we'll cover that on the next slide. The next green box that I'll cover is expected job end date. So that's at the bottom. You'll see that it's 7/22/2016 on this record. So it's very important to actively manage that expected job end date in PayPath specifically, because if that date comes to fruition, so if it's 7/22 and I haven't extended them, they will auto terminate even if I go ahead and do that transaction that day. So remember that the expected job end date needs to be updated one calendar date prior and approved. Otherwise, that termination will occur. The last red box is FLSA status, pay group, and employee type. Those aren't as important here in this transfer PowerPoint that we're going over. Good things to know. We'll go over this in our next topic-based Zoom more in depth. So that is what I wanted to cover here on the person org summary page. Now, the other review page that I would definitely recommend going into is the workforce job summary page. And so you'll see there are multiple tabs on the top, and each of these rows is very specific as it's giving you the effective date of when that change took place. It'll give you the sequence number. So that sequence number is important because remember, UCPath is reading the highest sequence number for any given effective date. So that's the most current job and position data for that record. This also gives you the action and action reason codes, which again are very important, specifically if you're submitting any type of form. So if you're doing any form corrections, which we'll go over in a few slides, you really want to utilize Workforce Job Summary because it's going to give you those specific action reason codes that you'll fill out in section 1. So I will bring this back up when we get to forms later on. So here is a summary and examples of both of the pages. So you can see that person org summary is really giving you that high level look at what this job record looks like. It's giving you basic information available to everyone. Versus if you look down in the workforce job summary, I can actually drill down to say, hey, let's look at this and see what happened on any given effective date. Remember, these are effective dates of transactions and not calendar dates. So this isn't something that we can really differentiate on this page, but there is a job data page that I won't reference in this PowerPoint much, but that would be somewhere where you can see that calendar date of why that was processed. The other thing that I want to bring up is just specifically looking at this transfer row of data that's here. So you can see that this one was from a promotion. So this, because you can see that there is data previous to the transfer, you would know that this was a UC transfer template because we've gone ahead and reused that empl record. So you can look at Workforce Job Summary to see what kind of transaction was processed based on what data exists. So because there's previous data, this empl record must have been reused in this example. Versus on the previous page, we can see that the transfer row on the very bottom is actually the same date as the hire, which was used for conversion. So this was a brand new position that was used specifically for this hire versus the subsequent screenshot here shows data prior to that hire transfer. So that's how you know the UC transfer was used. All right, so now we're going to get into performing transactions. So we'll actually go over intra-location transfers alone. We won't be doing anything inter-location transfer related today. And then we'll go over action reason codes and reclassifications in PayPath. So this is probably one of the most important slides of this entire presentation. So our guidance for intra-location transfers has changed several times over the last few months. So when we went live, UC transfer template was a highly recommended template to perform. And then subsequently, we've narrowed our use of it because of downstream impacts. So for staff folks, that is the only population you'll actually use the UC transfer template at this point for, and for two reasons alone. The first reason would be for open recruitment within the same department. So if your department has an existing employee who was recruited via open recruitment into your department again, then you can use the UC transfer template. And the reason why we would use the UC transfer template is because that's going to preserve our historical data access. And so it's not going to have any downstream impacts if we were going from department A to department B, for example. The second reason you would use a UC transfer template is specifically a staff transfer associated with open recruitment from VC Health Sciences or temporary employment services. So because that employee is coming from VC Health Sciences or TES to your department, you can do a UC transfer template because VC Health Sciences and temporary employment services have global access to see that historical data that isn't impacted by that change of department. Versus if you're going from department A to department B, those funding implications and expected job end date and things like that will be issues for you. And that new department is going to sever the access for historical data to the previous department. So these are the only two cases at UC San Diego that we will use the UC transfer template for. The first reason would be for open recruitment within the same department for a staff employee. The second specifically would be open recruitment from VC Health Sciences or temporary employment services of a staff person. Only two times we use the UC transfer template at this point. Now remember, the UC transfer template means that we are only processing the UC transfer template to the hiring department. That means no termination template should be submitted for the UC transfer template. That will adversely impact the employee and cause downstream impacts to their security, provisioning, all of those things. So the UC transfer template is a standalone for the hiring department only. Now, if that staff is being reclassified, we'll do that in PayPath. We're not going to cover that in depth today, but just as a heads up for anybody that might not know that. And then what we will most popularly do here at UC San Diego for a transfer is a concurrent hire and a voluntary termination. So if you're moving from one department that isn't VC Health Sciences or TES to another department, you're going to do the concurrent hire and voluntary termination. So an example of this would be going from psychology on campus to VC Health Sciences. In this case, we would do a concurrent hire and a voluntary termination because we want to preserve that historical data access to psychology in this example. So anytime somebody's moving from Department A to Department B, we want to do a concurrent hire and voluntary term, unless that is coming from VC Health Sciences or TES. Now on the academic side, we will never use a UC transfer template for academics. So I will repeat that. For any academic, we will never use a UC transfer template. We will always use a concurrent hire and a voluntary termination. And that comes directly from the APO office. So that needs to be abided by for any academic. Now there is an interesting combination that we have here if they are a GSR and a TA. In that case, we can use that concurrent hire and voluntary termination, or we can use the short work break functionality of the system that we have here. So we'll go over that in a few slides, but generally for GSRs and TAs, they're holding those positions at the same time on and off. So we would want to use that short work break designation instead of terminating and rehiring to avoid that paperwork. So we'll go over that in a few slides. So an exciting new development from our OCM team, we have a new transfer job aid called How to Process a Transfer, Choosing Your Templates. And this is about 4 pages that goes over almost any scenario that you can think of at UC San Diego. And so on the left-hand side, it's going to give you the scenario. The middle column will tell you what exact templates you need to use. It'll give you resources of what templates you should, or how to process each of those templates. And then there's some additional notes on the right-hand side to consider as well. So highly recommend this. Another useful point to point out on this job aid, in the upper right-hand corner, there's a hyperlink to our new department HR point of contact matrix. So if you're looking to do a transfer from one department to another, that should give you your department HR contact to coordinate with to make sure that that transfer is done appropriately. So let's go over some more information about known issues with the UC transfer template. So if you are doing a UC transfer template in one of those two specific instances that we use them, folks here at UC San Diego, two things that you want to remember are that that expected job end date on the previous employment is going to pull across into the new appointment. So that's going to require you to actively manage that in PayPath, either before the transfer or after the transfer. So very important that you're looking at that. The other known issue with the UC transfer template is that it's going to pull the current union code across to the new appointment. So if that union code is incorrect, and it likely could be, you're going to need to update that union code once that transfer has been completed and they're in their new appointment. All right. So at this point, I would want to remind everyone that most transfers here at UC San Diego are going to require two templates, unless it's those two specific situations for a staff employee at UC San Diego. So most transfers are going to require the concurrent hire, which is there is a staff and an academic version of that concurrent hire, and then a voluntary termination. So that concurrent hire will be processed by the hiring department, and the voluntary termination will be processed by the separating department. So again, this concurrent hire is going to create a new employee record for that employee. So this specific process is going to retain historical data to the separating department. So that is very important here. Not to mention the other issues associated with the UC transfer template, which can be direct retros. It can be that if an additional pay isn't stopped on the old record before that UC transfer is processed, that additional pay can come across, the union code and end date from the UC transfer template. So there are quite a few problems with the UC transfer template, which is why almost every situation requires this concurrent hire and voluntary termination at this point. So this is what the concurrent hire template looks like. You'll notice in the screenshot there is an additional pay tab that no longer exists on any of our hire templates. So it is just 3 tabs. It's fairly simple. When you're doing a concurrent hire, note that most of the information in the personal data tab will populate for you. There are the phone number and the address field that will show up as blank. If it's a concurrent hire, don't fill those 2 fields out. That personal data of the address and email don't show for security reasons, but they are populated on the back end. So if you type anything over those, you'll actually be overwriting the data, which we don't need to do because it already exists. So just as a heads up for everyone that that phone and address field are specifically already filled out in the back end. Then we come to our other tabs, which is the earnings distribution and the job data tab. So earnings distribution, you'll be able to set this up in your hire template if they have any job earnings distribution associated with the MCOP worksheet. So this gives you the opportunity to enter it here before their hire date so that that MCOP link is available for you on their calendar date when it comes to fruition for their hire. The other is the job data tab. So I wanted to put this out there that if you do have an FTE of 0, it's going to require you to put comments. So make sure you do input those. Otherwise, UCPC will likely cancel your transaction. So very important to put those. It also means that if you're putting an FTE of 0, then you would have to go ahead and do the additional pay in PayPath once that calendar date comes to fruition. So you won't have access to put additional pay in PayPath until their hire date becomes the calendar date. So how do you know what action reason code to use? So when you are reviewing why you're doing this transfer. It could be a job reclassification, it could be a promotion, something of that sort. We always recommend that you go to the UCOP UPK help site and review these action reason codes, because the number one reason that things are canceled at UCPC is because the incorrect action reason code or template is used. So very important to make sure that you go and review this, particularly if you're new or haven't done this transaction before. So highly recommend that. And note that these should be referred to fairly frequently, because these do change, and this is updated by UCPC on a every so often. So downloading this specific resource could put you out of date with what the actual action reason codes are at this time. So highly recommend going online and checking it every month or so specifically, instead of downloading it and using it forevermore. So this is how you would get to that specific concurrent hire template transaction if you wanted to review that UCOP UPK simulation. So this shows you how to do that concurrent hire transaction for a staff or an academic, because remember, those fields are going to be slightly different between the two templates. So some review for the concurrent hire. The concurrent hire template creates a new employee record, and the UC transfer template is going to reuse an existing EMPL record. To use the concurrent hire template, the employee must already have an active employee record at the time of hire. So if they have an inactive HR status on all of their current employee records, you won't be able to use a concurrent hire. Now, if you are backdating a concurrent hire to, let's say, 2 months ago when they were active, you can do that because they have active employment on the effective date of your hire. To avoid UCPC cancellation, timely processing of both the voluntary termination and the concurrent hire template must be done. So this is why that HR point of contact matrix exists, because we want to make sure that our HR initiators are communicating, make sure you're using the same effective date, make sure you're using the same action reason code, and that they're processed within a few days of each other. Otherwise, you'll see a UCPC cancellation on the initial template that doesn't have its accompanying template. So we have seen that before where UCPC cancels because there's too long of a lag time between the second department submitting their template. And then as a last note, that cancellation comes because UCPC will not process either of those HR template transactions unless both are submitted correctly. So they'll go ahead and cancel if the action reason codes don't match, if the effective dates don't match, or if the other isn't received timely. All right, so let's go over that PayPath reclassification that I had mentioned. So here in PayPath is where you're going to go ahead and update that expected job end date. You'll do that active management there. You can do an additional pay here once their hire date becomes the calendar date. And then on the job and position data, if you are reclassifying anybody upward or downward, you can go ahead and update those specific fields on those tabs. Now remember, if you do have to do a position data update, for example, you're changing the job code for this reclassification, that will automatically insert a new row onto the job data tab, which you can use for that reclassification. And once a PayPath transaction has been submitted, you're not going to be able to initiate a new transaction until that old transaction has been approved or denied. So very important to remember about PayPath. Then I wanted to bring up the short work break functionality. So specifically, this is for that GSR TA combo for academics. So if you are using short work break, you're able to put, for example, that GSR on a short work break for the fall quarter while that TA appointment is in effect. So that there was a defect that was recently resolved where you would have to actively manage the short work break appointment to reduce FTE down to 0 so that it didn't adversely impact the employee's benefits. But that defect has since been resolved a few months ago. And so now we are able to go ahead and process that short work break without an accompanying reduction of FTE, and it won't impact the benefits for that employee. So a really great change and update to the system that now it is working properly, that you can just put somebody on short work break and not worry about that impacting their benefits. So highly recommend this specifically for academic GSR and TA appointments that are in combination with each other at the same time, if they're not being terminated. So the next section that we'll move on to is viewing transaction status. So we'll go over how to review a transaction in progress, how do you clone a transaction, future dated rows and forms, and then payroll processing calendar. So these are the three review pages that we have in UCPath. So the Smart HR transaction page. So this is specifically transactions that you've submitted are and that are in progress. So for example, if you've submitted a transaction that hasn't been approved by your local approver, it's going to show up in the Smart HR transactions page. And we'll get to that on the next slide where we'll have a screenshot. The second is the SS Smart HR transactions page. So this one is nifty because you can actually view things that are in local approval workflow for anything within your business unit. So it does open up that access to the business unit. So if you're an SD Med or SD Campus, those are the two business units that we have. So you'll be able to see those depending on where you fall in the organizational structure. The last is the transaction status page. So this is where you'll be able to see the status of templates that have been approved or denied locally. So if it's been approved locally, you can actually check to see what status it's in at UCPC. So the 5 statuses are on the bottom of this slide. So requested, completed, hired, canceled, or denied. And it's also where you'll be able to clone a transaction that's been canceled or denied. Now for specifically the transaction status page, this is only going to be for templates within your row level access. So for example, if I'm in psychology, I'm not going to be able to see the chemistry department's transactions. I'll only be able to see those that I have access for. So that's very row level dependent. So this is what the Smart HR transaction page looks like. Navigation is on the left. And so here, the red box that we've outlined with the green text going to it is the transactions in progress. So here, these have not been approved yet, but if I notice on the first for Jerry Chin, for example, that I processed that termination with the wrong effective date, I can either ask my approver to deny the transaction, which in that case I can clone it afterwards, or I can click the select for that specific row and delete the transaction. Now, if I select it and delete it, I am removing that transaction from the UCPath system, and so I will have to start from scratch basically to go ahead and create that transaction and start anew. So after you've deleted a transaction here, you are literally removing it from processing and you will not have the ability to clone it anymore. So if it's something like a hire, that coordination with your local approver might be preferred because you can clone it and update it as needed versus if you delete it, you have to start from scratch. Now, if a transaction is denied or canceled and you want to clone it, but you've used the wrong transaction type, then you're going to have to actually start from scratch because the clone option doesn't allow you to change from a concurrent hire to a rehire, for example. So we'll go over that when we get to cloning as well. One last note here is that that top drop down where it says transaction type is not used by UC at all. And so you want to leave that at its all default because that will impact the select template field. So we don't want to narrow down our options in the select template field because those are actually the templates that we will designate here at UC San Diego. So here's the SS Smart HR transactions page. So like I said, this will display templates in your local approval within your business unit specifically. So if you go to this page, it's also where you would approve or deny a transaction if you're a local approver. And you can click on the hyperlink here. So this would be Kyle Gonzalez. If you were to click on that hyperlink, it'll bring you into this template transaction and you can review the information that's listed there. It also has the transaction status of pending because it hasn't been locally approved yet. So very nifty to locate anything that you're looking for that hasn't gone through that local approval yet. The last page that we have is the transaction status page. So this is where you can view things that have been locally approved or denied, and if something's been canceled by UCPC, or to see the general status of what is going on at UCPC. So this is a helpful page because you can see those comments from the cancellation. You can go ahead and clone it, different things like that. So this is a very helpful page when reviewing. The other thing to note is if you look on this SS Smart HR transactions page on the bottom, you'll see that there's the workflow listed there already. So if you're wondering where it is in processing here at the location at UC San Diego, you can look down here and see who's approved it, who submitted it, what time, and different things like that. So this page is very helpful for tracking where your transaction is prior to local approval. All right, so we will get into cloning a template. So if your template has been canceled or it's been denied, you can go ahead and clone that template. Remember, if you go ahead and delete that template out of either this transaction status page, or if you delete it out of this Smart HR transactions page, you will not be able to clone it anymore because you've removed that from the system. So in order to clone something, it has to be denied or canceled, and you can't delete it out of the system. All right, and so once that template has been either processed, canceled, or denied, that template initiator will be notified via email to let them know what has happened to their template. So if you need to see any kind of a simulation on how to do that cloning process, there is a UPK simulation on the UCPath help site. So our key takeaways for viewing transaction status is local approvers deny a template transaction and UCPC would cancel a template. You can use the Smart HR transactions page to review or delete template transactions you've initiated that are in progress. You can use the SS Smart HR transactions page to review local AWE status and approver comments for template transactions in your business unit. And lastly, you can use the transaction page um, to view the status of transactions that have been approved or denied locally and to clone transactions. So the next thing that I wanted to bring to you folks is something that I've seen several times, and that's future dated rows. So this is another thing to think about if you're doing a UC transfer template specifically. We have seen an employee go from department A to department B, and part of that transfer process is that the UC Path Center will delete any future dated rows after that effective date of the hire. And we've seen that UCPC sometimes forgets to do that. So that's another reason why we don't use the UC transfer template in general. But if that UC transfer template is done and UCPC forgets to do that deletion of future dated rows, it will actually revert that employee back to their old appointment with all of the associated position and job data. So this shows you an example of that happening where Todd went ahead and did a transaction effective on 12/1, 6 months early. And then Tanya went ahead and did a transfer into the new position, and UCPC forgot to delete that future dated change that Todd had already done. And then case will have to submit a job data update form to the UC Path Center via case to request them to delete that future dated row. So typically this doesn't happen, but it is something that we've seen before. So just as a heads up, if you do use that UC transfer template by accident, I would assume, because generally we won't with the new UC San Diego guidance of only 2 reasons of using that template, you'd want to go into workforce job summary and make sure that there are no future dated rows associated with that new record that you've brought on from the old department. So this is what the job data update form looks like. I mentioned that we would reference back to the workforce job summary screenshot that I showed you. And so I want to go over this form submission process in a little bit more detail than I think we've done in previous sessions. So we've split this into 3 different sections. Section 1, you'll see that every field on section 1 has an asterisk. So what section 1 is really doing is the UC Path Center is asking you to identify the row of data that you want updated, deleted, or added. So in section 1 specifically, we're going to want to use workforce job summary because that's going to give us the current effective date on that row of data. It's going to give you the action code, the reason code, what that effective sequence number is, the EMPL record, all of that data to say, hey, UCPath, I actually want to change this specific row of data, whether we're deleting, adding, or whatever you might be doing. Section 1 is specifically identifying what row of data we want to correct. Now, section 2, this is where we're going to input the changes we want to that specific field. You'll notice that in section 2, there's only one field that has a red asterisk, which is the business unit. So anything that you're looking to change in section 2 is optional basically, except for that business unit field. So if I'm only trying to change the FTE, for example, I don't have to fill out department number, position number, reports to, job code, all of these other fields that don't have red asterisks. I would only input those data fields that need updating in section 2. So the reason why I mention this is I've seen folks fill out this entire section 2 with data that already exists that isn't changing, and so that's a use of your time that you don't have to do. So very important that here in section 2, we're identifying that correction to data, not necessarily the data that exists. Now in section 3, this is where we're going to go through AWE basically outside of the system. So we have to send this form to our local approver to go ahead and sign off basically. Then in the initiator comments, this is where you're going to describe what you're trying to accomplish. So in section 1, we identified what row of data we're looking to change or update. So for example, I had hired somebody on 7.2, but they were supposed to be hired on 7.1. Section 1, I'm going to actually identify that 7.2 row that was processed incorrectly. And then in section 3 in the comments, I'm going to ask UCPC to change that hire date from 7.2 to 7.1. So again, section 1 is identifying what already exists so that they can locate the row for updating. Section 2 is for any fields that actually exist. And section 3, if it's the effective date that needs to be changed, you would put that in the comments because that doesn't exist in section 2. There's not a place for you to say, I need to change the effective hire date of my transaction, except for in section 3. And then this is how you would submit that form that you've now filled out. In the upper right-hand corner, you can click Ask UCPath. You can submit an inquiry on behalf of yourself or for another employee. So that is definitely something that you can do. Another note here that I want to call out is if you're transferring an employee from a position that accrues comp time to a non-accruing position, our recommendation is to submit a case on behalf of that employee asking for that comp time to be paid out if you can't do it in eco time. So generally you can process that comp time payout in eco time if you're using units and not percentage. Percentage will overpay that employee for their comp time. So in eco time you can pay out, but if you've missed that deadline or something happens, you can submit this via case as well. Now, as a last note on this submitting a case, if you are transacting, for example, you're in central HR, but you only have departmental access to chemistry, if you have departmental access to transact on chemistry, but not on your own department, for example, central HR, you're not going to be able to submit a case on behalf of yourself. So you can only submit a case for those you have actual access for. So if you fall into that kind of oddball scenario where you don't transact on your own department, you'll have to ask another transactor that does transact on your department to submit on your behalf. Lastly, we have the payroll processing calendar. So any templates that we're processing, whether it's a voluntary termination, a concurrent hire, or a UC transfer template, will all need to be submitted by that employee data change deadline at 3 p.m. So that is a very important deadline. And just as a reminder, it needs to be approved by that deadline, not necessarily initiated by the HR initiator. So this is an approval deadline. If that 3 p.m. deadline is not met, then we risk that change not impacting the employee and paying them either in the wrong job and then having to go back and do overpayments. And it becomes a very cumbersome process if we don't meet this deadline. So very important to keep in mind. All right, and so now we will get into wrapping up, and then following this, we will go into a Q&A session for our last 10 minutes. So things to remember as an HR initiator, if you're transferring an employee who has system access, it's very important for you to submit a snow ticket to remove that system access. So if I'm transferring employee from department A to department B, even though we're doing a concurrent hire and a voluntary termination, that access to your department that they're transacting on will remain for that employee unless we submit a snow ticket to remove that system access. So if we go to the service and support page under UCPath, there is a specific form to submit for removing access at this point, which has been separated out from the granting access. So I can't stress this enough that it's very important to submit a ticket to remove that system access. Otherwise, they will have that access going forward into their new position. If you realize you've made a mistake before you've submitted your template, whether that's a UC transfer or a termination or a concurrent hire, you can delete that template from your Smart HR templates page. That will remove that cloning option, like I've said before, but then you can go ahead and resubmit it with that correct data. Or you can ask your approver to deny that transaction, and then you'll have that cloning ability on the transaction status page. If your approver has already approved the transaction that has an error included in it, you can submit a case to UCPC and ask them to cancel the transaction, and that would give you that cloning ability. Or if you don't want to risk it, which is my personal preference, I'm not a big risk taker in UCPath in general. So if you have seen that that has been approved locally here already, you can delete that in the transaction status page. But again, that will make it so that you are unable to clone it. So future dated rows, future dated hires, my apologies, don't have access until their start date. So for example, if you've got an employee starting on 8/1 and we're in the middle of July, they aren't going to be able to log into UCPath Online Self-Service until that 8/1 date to set up their direct deposit, access tax forms, etc. So PeopleSoft is effective date driven, not necessarily calendar date driven. And then future dated hire records also cannot be updated until their start date. So for example, if I hire somebody 2 months from now and they haven't done their oath and patent, I'm not going to be able to enter that until their hire date comes to fruition. So you can see in several examples, whether it's funding entry, the MCOP worksheet, employees accessing the UCPath online self-service, you updating personal data, all of this is driven by that effective date coming to fruition as the calendar date. So UCPath is most certainly designed for you to put things in and solidify them now versus waiting to do things later retroactively. Or so it's very important to have all of your information ready before you go in and start doing transactions. So our best practices, just to reiterate, is reviewing person org summary before initiating a template transaction. So having that high level overview, are they on active status? Different things like that are very important before you start the template transaction. Next is verifying you've created the position before you start the template transaction. So if you don't have a template to hire the person, or if you don't have the position number available to hire the person into, you're not going to be able to process that transaction. The next is paying close attention to effective dates. So again, effective date indicates when you can start that new status. So that's going to be your hire date. When are they effectively terminated, not at the university anymore? So that effective date is so important, especially when we do the concurrent hire and voluntary termination, because those two dates need to match in order for UCPC to process both of them. That also prevents a break in service to the employee. So very important that those effective dates match those two templates. Next, don't let an employee auto-terminate an error. So make sure you're actively managing that expected job end date. And if somebody does auto-terminate before they are going to transfer, you'll have to rehire, reinstate them before taking your separation action. So you're going to create a bit more work for yourself if that does occur. And UCPC will make sure that you know that you need to rehire, reinstate them before the transfer, because they will not take any other action until that's done. Make sure you're coordinating with other departments as needed. And so we have that HR point of contact matrix that was just newly released, I believe, in the last month. So make sure that we're utilizing that so that we know who to contact in different departments, that we're using the same action reason code and the same effective date on our concurrent hire and voluntary termination templates. So very important that we're coordinating, and it's such a different process from PPS that this coordination needs to be done outside of the system. The last is to review key resources as often as you need. So if you're doing one of these transfers or concurrent hires for the first time, make sure you're using that action reason codes and descriptions job aid. That is the most common reason that templates are canceled, is the incorrect use of codes. So very important there. And then lastly, the payroll processing calendar, making sure that you're submitting things in time and that they're approved in time to impact the upcoming payroll. So our key takeaways for this presentation is a UC transfer template moves the employee from one position to another within the same department if it's via open recruitment, or from VC Health Sciences and TS to a campus department. So again, those are the only two reasons we will use a UC transfer template, both for staff employees specifically. That's going to utilize the existing EMPL record for that transfer. On the opposite end, we'll use the concurrent hire and voluntary termination template to move employees from one position to another at different UC locations, from one department to another, or between staff and academic positions. And that concurrent hire template is going to create a new EMPL record for the employee. So the concurrent hire and voluntary termination templates need to have effective dates and action reason codes that are identical for UCPC to process. I want to thank everybody for your time today. I really appreciate it. We are glad to have you all and bring some clarity to this topic. I know it's been a long time coming that folks have wanted this.